You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Welcome to the Decisive Podcast, brought to you by S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam. In this episode, we're discussing highlights of the recent Transpacific Maritime, or TPM, conference, and looking ahead to the Breakbulk conference. Both TPM and Breakbulk are organized by the Journal of Commerce, and we have Mark Szakonyi, Executive Editor of the Journal of Commerce, with us today, along with Chris Rogers, Head of Supply Chain Research at S&P Global Market Intelligence. We've got some tariff news coming in April, which is just around the corner as we're recording this. Chris, what are we watching for, and how might this impact supply chains for the rest of the year?
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of tariff news, not just in April, but on an ongoing basis as well. I think we can break it into three big areas. First is this fair and reciprocal plan. So this is the toolkit by which President Trump wants to apply tariffs to most other countries in the world. That might be driven by their tariff rates. So if they're higher than the US, might also be driven by sales taxes. So the Trump administration doesn't like value-added tax in Europe, for example. Second area will be a bunch of specialist tariffs on particular sectors. We've already seen autos, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors having been targeted. There's also reviews ongoing of copper and lumber as well. And then the third area is the ongoing kind of hangover of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which haven't yet, as of when we're recording, been fully implemented, and a lot of other ad hoc measures as well. What we've been seeing and what we've been hearing from our customers, both at TPM and since, is that a lot of that is going to feed into pricing rather than necessarily a shift in supply chains straight away. So if you don't know what the tariff outlook's going to be a year, 2 or 3 years down the line, which is how long it takes to reform your supply chain, find new suppliers, find new manufacturing locations, then you'll just try and pass it through to your customers. So primarily that's the main impact we expect to see in supply chains on the short term.
Yeah, and interestingly, it was reported that China actually called some of the big BCOs and said, listen, you need to stop putting so much pressure on your suppliers in the sense of for the new procurement soundtracks, trying to push those additional costs back to the factories. So that's very, very sensitive. But I definitely think Chris is spot on in the terms of people are kind of just holding off. A lot of the advice that we heard at TPM was basically the idea of don't panic right now. You're only going to cause yourself more cost and headache if you try to, respond to every new market development.
I would say, though, Mark, that we do want people to pay very close attention, both to what Journal of Commerce have got to say and what our researchers got to say. But, in all seriousness, it's a great point about that international aspect. If goods aren't going to come to the US because they become too expensive, they'll need to go elsewhere in the world. So we saw first time around, so under the former Trump administration, that the tariffs that were applied to China partly meant that Chinese goods went elsewhere in the world. And I guess that's why the shipping industry, to a certain extent, can be a little bit relaxed about tariffs in the near term, kind of per se, because goods will just go somewhere else, even if they don't come to the United States.
Yeah, we have heard the carriers. I mean, for years they've been expanding their networks into Southeast Asia and so on. I would say though, right now we're kind of in a very hold and see. When I talk to US importers and carriers, we haven't seen the volumes yet, but there's definitely a sense that things are a little bit softer. And the decline in spot rates on the Trans-Pacific suggests that there's some extra weakness, but it's too soon to know because everybody's kind of holding on and we may see a rev up in orders. But at the same time, I'm sure as Chris can note, the consumer confidence indices are not pointing to the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Our most recent data is for February on the US inbound, and on a days adjusted basis, because there was a leap year last year, because life isn't complicated enough when we're doing our statistics, imports to the US were actually up by 8% in February. That might be kind of a last gasp, get across the line, but we've always got the weirdness around the timing of the Lunar New Year. I think that the shift in shipping rates that we've seen that Mark referred to has really been quite significant. If we look at the Commodity Insights Platts figures for shipping rates, they've come down to around $900 per 20-foot equivalent unit of container freight. That's Asia into West Coast North America. Last July, they were just under 4,000. So we've seen quite a precipitous drop already.
And speaking of rates, I mean, TPM, Mark, is typically a time for rate negotiations, right? How did the specter of tariffs and the uncertainty around that influence those negotiations this time around?
Well, I think it put a little bit of a pause. There's some years when folks are basically kind of just finalizing their contract at TPM. That wasn't the case this year. People are definitely looking at the spot rate weaknesses and seeing what they can get. At the same time, we're hearing at least some of the carriers that I'm talking to are being a little bit conservative in terms of their MQCs. So their minimum quantity commitments and contracts, they want to get a good floor like usual. But I think there's also a sense that yes, there's overcapacity. Yes, there's tariffs, but this is a market that can come out of line really fast. And there might be a play for higher spot rates in the second half. Obviously, a lot of that depends on the Red Sea.
I think there's an interesting point about that kind of more conservative approach to making commitments. So we just don't know effect. One of the things we were hearing, speaking to procurement managers at the conference and subsequently, is a desire to try and inoculate risk as much as possible. So that's kind of playing out a little bit in decisions we're seeing to ask for tariffs to be treated separately to the rest of a procurement conversation. So I will buy widgets for you from X, excluding tariffs. And if tariffs are there, we'll decide. Obviously, as the importer, I'm the person writing the check to pay them, but maybe you give me a rebate and of a bit, and I pass a bit of it on to my customers, and we find a way. But at least that way, we're not trying to second guess where tariffs might be in a few months' time.
And there's volumes that are gonna have to move, whether there's tariff pressure or not. I mean, I was talking to some shippers last week, and they're like, "Back to school, it's happening. Folks are still gonna buy that stuff. They may not buy as much, but they're gonna buy it."
Oh, don't say peak season already, man. It's
I just said back to school. I didn't drop the P word yet.
One of the peak seasons, right?
Right.
One
One
of
a mini peak.
Mark, you mentioned the Red Sea there. Our outlook for shipping disruption there remains severe through 2025. If that outlook does shift and the Red Sea becomes a safer route for container ships, what would that look like for carriers?
Well, it would I mean, I guess think for the whole industry, it would look at least 3 to 6 months of congestion or disruption. It would most likely spill into congestion in Northern European ports, maybe to a lesser degree to some East Coast ports in North America. In terms of the market dynamics, I mean, that's the thing that the carriers are pointing to and saying, "Hey, if this capacity comes out, that changes the whole equation, and we're gonna be in a bigger overcapacity issue." I think there's a lot of truth to that, but at the same time, there's a lot of levers that they can pull, whether it's slower steaming some of their vessels, they could potentially even idle, which they've really not done much. So there's still some options. And then another thing that we heard from TPM here is that even when we look over the last couple years, the actual real functional capacity that's added is quite modest. I mean, you're looking at mid-single digits, meaning that more and more of the capacity that's being deployed is spending more of its time outside of ports waiting than actually delivering goods. So that's basically reducing the effective capacity. So that's why one of the messages that we were kind of definitely heard at TPM and underscoring was that we can't think of capacity and demand in the same way. 20 years ago, you could look at the order book, you could look at the average volume, and you didn't need to be quite brilliant. You could just say, wow, there's going to be overcapacity. The carriers are going to start undercutting each other. Rates are going to get low, blah, blah, blah. Things are different now.
I think on that as well, from a competitive perspective, one of the things we look after is the International Maritime Organization's numbering database. So we have a lot of information, as Mark alluded to, on new capacity coming into the system. And whilst, in a given year it might be 6 or 7%, we do have, excuse the pun, a bow wave of new capacity coming over the next 3 or 4 years. Back of the envelope, Red Sea diversions take about 6% out of the global shipping network in terms of capacity of vessels going more slowly. Now, our forecast for growth in container operations this year globally is about 4%. So we've got a little bit of demand growth, got quite a bit more of capacity growth coming through. So to Mark's point, it comes down to the competitive dynamics amongst the shipping companies. Are they going to maintain the discipline that we've seen over the past couple of years? If we think back to 2016, well, last time there was a lot of extra capacity coming and we had a drop in demand, it was a bit of a mess. Container rates collapsed. Clearly, the shipping companies had a lot of debt, and we actually had one company enter financial failure. This time around, again, is different. Quite apart from anything else, the container line don't have loads of debt this time around, so they haven't got the banks breathing down their necks saying, you've got to make money at any cost. So that discipline thing, particularly in an environment where we're seeing a realignment in how the shipping industry organizes itself, is going to be really interesting to play out. For us, to a certain extent, you get a lot more boats around and not quite as much demand around. From an economic perspective, that suggests downward, not upward pressure. But given that rates vary so wildly, one of the speakers at TPM made the point that shipping rates can virtually double or halve in no time at all on the basis of very small changes in network operation. That could work in both directions. If discipline doesn't hold, then things could get a little bit messy quite quickly.
So, pivoting to another hot topic from TPM, the proposed port tax on Chinese owned or Chinese built vessels. What were attendees saying about that? And I mean, how are carriers and shippers preparing for that possibility, Mark?
Well, initial impression was, wow, that's quite ambitious. But at the same time, even though it seems for many of us in the industry, the idea of restoring US shipbuilding, particularly via tonnage tax, seems a hard line to see, the market nonetheless is preparing for it. And the response, I would say, is, a couple things. First, the carriers have been very clear that it may mean the loss of calling on smaller ports. Soren Toff, head of MSC, noted that the cost would be really heavy on the transatlantic, and you could see fewer services there. So basically, just kind of a pullback into their network because every time you're calling a US port, you're looking at, at least $1 million in extra tax. So why not reduce your exposure? And then, of course, the other question is, well, then how does the cost get passed on? I think it's highly unlikely that you will see some carriers say, hey, your vessel is on a Korean ship coming from Shanghai, therefore, no tonnage surcharge. More likely than not, they're going to provide across the board tonnage, whether they have South Korean ships or Chinese ships, just because of a matter of actually being able to push this cost on. And they've done it similarly before with the low sulfur costs. They can't come together and say this is the range of costs that we're ready for in terms of surcharges, but they can individually float and then the market kind of comes to a consensus. But I mean, the estimates are, anything from like 600 to 900, $1,000 added cost on a TEU. So it is going to be significant. There's also questions of how the system would actually be able to collect this money. We held off on some of the de minimis rules that were imposed by the Trump administration simply because Customs and Borders didn't have the software and capacity to handle it. So, Trump, I think earlier in early March noted that there was going to be some more details on the shipbuilding program come about. But I would say folks are taking it seriously, even if they have major questions on its feasibility, both in terms of restoring US shipbuilding, but also just being processed.
In our research, we came up anywhere between $200 and $400 per 20-foot equivalent unit, so standard size container. Heard some similar numbers around TPM. To Mark's point, nobody wants to put a hard number in the field because that then becomes an anchoring point for negotiations. But let's say it's the lower end of 200. The transatlantic rate at the moment is 1,000. That's 20%, roughly speaking, of the shipping rate. That's just huge. So, how does that get passed on? The other thing we've been thinking through from a supply chain perspective is assuming that this money in some way ends up being used to subsidize the creation of a renewed US shipbuilding industry, where does it go? Because a lot of the old shipyards were closed. They've been turned into, beautiful apartment complexes and seaside resorts and all this kind of thing. So actually finding the locations to build these things. Not all of the steel is currently made in the US, so you'd need that whole back end supply chain to be stood up. This is the work of a decade or more. So, a few snap reactions and charges aren't going to cut it.
Chris, tell us about the Gemini model and what the significance of that is.
Yeah, so what we've seen in the shipping industry for many years was all the companies doing the same thing. You had three big shipping alliances. They ran their routes rather like a cruise ship, different port every day, stop for 9 hours, jump off, have a bottle of rum and a bit of a party, come back and go to the next port. What we saw at the beginning of this year is the creation of a new system. So two of the shipping companies, Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, have set up a new alliance called Gemini. And rather than following this string approach, port to port to port, they have hub and spoke. They have five big hubs where the big vessels they have go from one hub to another, backward and forward. And then they have shuttle services that go to all of the smaller ports. The idea behind that is that those bigger vessels can then be run on a more efficient basis. In theory, that should mean a combination of higher profitability for the firms and or lower cost for consumers if they choose to pass that through to the cargo owners. The challenge, of course, is can you achieve the same reliability? There's a lot more taking boxes on and off boats with that new model. And we certainly were interested to see and will be analyzing using our network graph analysis to see whether that is actually proving to be effective and is the way of the future, or whether at some stage Gemini just have to go back to doing what everyone else does because it's the tried and tested way. But there's certainly a number of presentations on that at TPM, and I guess, Mark, a lot of folks are talking about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the early signs were pretty good. We heard from Hapag-Lloyd CEO Rolf Haben Janssen that it was a strong start. They were keeping to their 90% reliability. I moderated another session in which Simon Sittabel of EEC, a kind of a third-party tracker, was saying that things were lining up. But at the time, the full loops haven't been completed. It's still early days, but I think there's far less skepticism about it than there was a year ago at TPM when it was kind of shrugged off as a glorified hub and spoke rather than something far grander, more sophisticated, and really something that Maersk has been planning for years, and that can be seen in many of its terminal investments to these kind of secondary hubs rather than just, say, the Singapore.
Well, let's look ahead to Breakbulk, which is coming up towards the end of April. Mark, what is Breakbulk and who attends that conference?
Yeah, so that's our annual event in New Orleans. It focused obviously on the break bulk special project heavy lift industry. So that's folks bringing anything really out of gauge that's not going to move into a container or move on a bulk vessel. So that's from wind turbines to energy gas equipment. If it's massive and outsized, these folks are handling it. Obviously, one of the big issues is that USTR thing that we discussed on the container side. A lot of folks kind of wondering how that's going to be worked as a kind of government incident surcharge. There's less worry, at least so far within the break bulk industry about it, partly because the market's quite busy outside of North America. But notably, there aren't many US built break bulk vessels. So there's a big concern of where this capacity would come from if this plan comes through. And then to a degree, they're dependent on the container market. So if the container market falls and rates become really low, you're going to start seeing the carriers being even more aggressive for some of that heavy lift project cargo. So that has an impact on them as well. But it consisting of who's going to be there, it's going to be the forwarders, it's going to be the cargo owners, it's going to be the carriers, and of course, the ports and marine terminals that facilitate that on the land side.
I guess there's also going to be plenty of discussion of tariffs. A lot of these guys are supporting big projects where suddenly having an additional cost of 20% from China or 25% from Canada can really be a kind of a make or break. I guess the other thing we haven't discussed at all, but is floating about certainly as an issue we're watching in the rest of this year, the evolution in environmental policies. The International Maritime Organization has got a big meeting in April where it's meant to be making some decisions on decarbonisation. The shipping industry is now part of the European Union's emission trading scheme as well. So we're certainly urging people, look, tariffs tend to suck all of the oxygen out of the room, but step outside, take a breather, and see what else is going on.
Yeah, emissions and supply chains is the really hot topic within the energy transition sphere for sure. So what will be the big topics at Breakbulk then, Mark?
Well, I think USTR, we'll be hearing from our colleague Susan a lot about kind of what the order book looks like and the balance in the market. Obviously, as Chris noted, quite a bit on tariffs. Another thing that's really been a hit to the industry has been the pullback on wind projects. So that's hitting, the turbines and a lot of that was really, really good business for the industry in recent years. There's some excitement about some carbon capture for coal power that we're seeing kind of popping up in the Gulf. So it'll be interesting to see how much of that business will offset the loss in the wind energy vertical.
Well, we've unpacked a lot today. Sounds like a good place to wrap up our discussion. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.